Welcome to Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. Usually, Ann Lipton and I cover this. She's the law professor at Tulane, but Ann has one more weekend to travel. I think it was family or personal this time, not a conference, as much as I envy her going to conferences. So instead, Matt Moscardi, our producer, collaborator, colleague, and friend, and I are together here to talk about kind of what we've seen so far for the Proxy season 2025. It's getting kind of interesting in some really unusual and unexpected ways. Matt, say
season.
Hi. How are you doing?
Oh, I am lovely, Mike. It's good to be back. It's I missed you terribly.
Yes, I know. Well, I talk to you weekly as we work
Every
on
single
other
week,
podcasts,
yes.
but actually having a chance for us to talk about what's going on in the world is always kind of fun. So Matt follows, activism and corp gov from a slightly different angle than what Ann and I do. Ann, of course, follows the developments in legal theory and statutes and so forth, and I look at proxy contests and financial activists and who's crapping all over whom. But Matt, through Free Float Analytics and his podcast Proxy Countant and also Business Pants that he does with business partner Damian Rollis, mostly follows hardcore corp gov stuff related to boards and so on, and we can talk about that a little more. But he also has some of observations, views, ideas about what he's seen. So we thought we'd kind of compare notes about what's going on. Now I have some data I was going to talk about, but Matt, what do you got for us? What have you seen so far in Proxy season 2025?
Well, I won't bury the lead. This is the year of the activist. This is your moment to shine.
I know. Right? I'm feeling so warm. It's great.
I mean, that's all the data, basically, even the data I'm going to talk about later. And just for point of reference for anyone who's listening, what we track is director performance data. We track director demographic data, their skills, and all that kind of stuff.
Boards of directors. Moneyball for boards.
It's Moneyball for boards.
A board is a team, and a director is a player.
That's right. And we all the podcasts we do, Business Pants and Proxy Countdown, we're tracking all the news. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between the news that you're reading and that we're reading. Yes. We just have wider breadth of news that we're covering, and everything points to activists are the last bastion of governance right now. There's sort of been, I know you've talked about on this pod, rational apathy. You've talked about all of this sort of long-standing cultural habitual voting of investors. Yeah. But the rise in activism at the beginning of this proxy season is actually moving the averages for how directors are getting voted.
What you're seeing in your director metrics.
What we're seeing in the data. So we can get to that in a second, but it's your moment to shine here.
All right, okay. Well, let's talk about some of the aggregates that we've started to see. And again, we talk about proxy season, and again, I think I've shared this with you. I don't love that term. It makes it sound like it's spring and it's proxy season.
But it's it doubles down the sports analogy.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point.
I'm behind it.
That's fine. That's fine. I just activism is kind of a year-roundish kind of thing, but there's annual meeting season.
Yeah.
But anyway,
there you go.
So in terms of the hardcore stuff, proxy contests, activists looking for board seats. One of the sources I happen to like is a quarterly report from Barclays Investment Bank, and Jim Rossman there does a nice workmanlike job in kind of bringing this together. Barclays just sent out their quarterly a week or so ago. They report a 43% increase in activist projects this year relative to 2024. And again, everyone has different ways they count or don't count a project. I tend to be a little more strict about it, looking for proxy materials being filed with the SEC. But anyway, however Barclays counted, a 43% increase this year over last year is significant. And they also do a global report, I really think only mostly about the U.S. They reported that there are 40 active or 40 companies that were responding to activist campaigns as of March 31st, which is a large number. In fact, they said that they were on track to match or even exceed the previous high of a total of 144 campaigns for 2022, which I think, we can talk about the impact of this and how it's affecting companies and so forth, but just in terms of numbers of situations, this feels like a lot. There's a lot to try to keep track of. So go ahead.
we're matching up the post-COVID activist boom.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Which is not, and this is not driven by a pandemic. This is driven by basically, corporate
driven
performance.
By performance.
Yeah,
there's we'll talk a little later about how the universal proxy card finally is starting. People are getting used to it, and I think it's affecting not only the number but the types of contests. Actually, we'll talk about that for a second right now. So I think I have a little kind of side hobby where I track actual contests because I'm kind of curious about how universal proxy card affects voting. Mm-hmm. How just usual shareholders, funds, individuals, I guess, vote in director elections. And so I have this little thing I track. And so I have on my little roster that there are 30 pending contests right now as of actually an hour ago. And that's a big increase over what my little roster had for 2024 for last year. And we can break these down a little bit in some really interesting ways. So out of those 30 pending contests, 14 of them, almost half, have an activist that is seeking all available board seats that are up for election. Now that's kind of unprecedented.
That's a lot.
Yes, for an activist to try to elect every available director, and when I say available, I mean for some boards it's the whole board. You got a board of 8, I don't know, and they're nominating 8 people. But many of these are classified boards, so there's 3 or 4 people out of a class this year out of maybe 12, and so there are activists that are seeking the whole class. So 14, almost half, are seeking the whole thing. Another 8 are looking for a majority of the available seats. So, a board of 11, they're looking for 6, or a class of 4, they're looking for 2 or more. Okay, and that's also big because the proxy advisors look at majority slates a little differently than everybody else. Shareholder voters tend to look a little more critically at activists that are looking for a majority. So 22 out of these 30 are looking for a majority or better. And that's a huge increase. Just to round that out, another 6 are looking for less than a majority, and then only 2 are seeking just 1 seat. And it used to be pretty standard that an activist would look for maybe 1 or 2 seats. But for, all but 2 of these to be going for multiple seats and for well over half to be looking for majority, is a significant show of assertion of strength or of power here in these contests.
How many of them are repeats? Because I know a number of the activists are looking for seats or increased number of seats at companies that they've been involved with or had other activists involved with in the last 5 years.
Only 2 or 3. One of them I'm going to talk about in a little while. There's a really interesting one.
Because I do notice that there seems to be a trend that they're targeting, a lot of them are targeting classified boards or companies with like weird governance structures to begin with, which actually prohibits them from looking, for majorities. I wonder how many of them would actually go for the majority if not for sort of the governance restrictions.
That's a great question. It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
So we can also look. In addition to those 30, the preliminary results seem to favor the activists. I was tracking. There have been 7 proxy contests that actually went to an actual vote by now. And again, we're going to start seeing a lot more votes, as you could expect, in the next month or 2. But up till now, there were 7 that went to a vote. Activists won all of what they were looking for, or most of what they were looking for, in 3 of those, and that includes a contest I love talking about in the past, Massimo, where Politan Capital won 2 out of 2 seats, and that was also the one where Mantle Ridge, which is Paul Halal's fund, won 3 out of 4 seats they were looking for at Air Products. Those were two kind of interesting contests with really effective activist investors. The company won all seats in 3 out of those 7, so the activists got nothing, including a real unfortunate one at Barrington Capital, which had looked for 3 seats at a company called Matthews and actually got the endorsement of both ISS and Glass Lewis. And the company had come in at kind of the 11th hour and made a bunch of promises to shareholders, and shareholders, thought enough of those promises, which in my opinion were kind of empty, to re-elect the entire board. I'm pretty sure Barrington will be back next year to try to do something different. And then in 1 out of the 7, the activists just won a single seat. So in contrast, if you look back at 2024, in 15. There are only 15 content. The thing we kind of forget is, we hear about activism all the time, at least in prior years. There's just not that many proxy contests that go to an outcome. Sometimes it seems like there's dozens or more. But in 2024, there were only 15 where we got to a voting outcome. And in 11 of those, activists got nothing, got 0 seats. In 2 of them, activists got a couple seats, some of what they were looking for, and only 2 out of 15 in all of proxy season 2024 did activists win all the seats they were looking for. So there's a really interesting difference so far between what we saw last year and what we're starting to see this year, between preliminary results that seem to favor activists and a lot of the 30 contests announced, and there's probably a few more that are going to become public pretty soon. So there, as you said, echoing what you said, there's a lot of prospective activity here that seem to favor, what activists are trying to accomplish. So.
What's interesting about it too is because as an activist, you're thinking in a binary way, right? Like you won the contest or you didn't win the contest, you won the seat or you didn't win the seat. Yeah. But from a vote percent way, because the data that we have, right, there's roughly 120 or so votes that have happened for U.S. companies so far.
So far this year? Go ahead.
Yeah, that I have data on, right? I think there's more, but the data lags. So, but the average vote for directors is 96% historically. Right. It's basically stayed that way.
Yeah, right.
But this year so far, been that way forever, literally forever.
Yeah.
But this year so far, it's 94%.
Oh,
and
no
it's
kidding.
driven almost entirely by companies that have been targeted by activists, because the directors are getting less support at companies targeted by activists, even when the activists aren't winning. In fact, activists who are doing shareholder proposals on top of or in, solely or in addition to director votes, they're actually getting 10 percentage point more vote averages. They're not winning them all, but investors are looking at them and backing them more. Like more and more investors are backing them. So the reality is, even when they're losing, they're winning, right? Like because if you view any activist campaign as a multi-year campaign, you have primed the pump for next year by reducing the share of investors who are voting for those directors this year.
And you've started building a case with the shareholder base. You started building some trust, some credibility with the shareholder base. And, contrary to kind of common conventional wisdom, a lot of these activists are multi-year holders of shares. Sometimes they trade in and out, they'll trim their position, they'll add to it, but a lot of the time, as we'll talk about one in a little while, they've been around for a long time and they're not going anywhere. And so, companies make a mistake by thinking, okay, we kind of prevailed here, like Matthews. Okay, I know the folks at Barrington, they are very tough and they're not going away. And so Matthews is making a big mistake if they sort of think, okay, we kind of beat them back and won the 3 seats they were looking for. No. Barrington, it's unlikely that they're going to walk away from this just as a result of, this one director vote. So,
I mean, there's also fascinating, sort of themes emerging from the activists, right? Because we talked about the fact that a lot of these are classified boards, or more of them than have been in the past. But on top of that, right, they're getting more support. They're targeting poor governed companies, right? By traditional governance standards on top of just performance standards, right? It's not just their underperforming. It's you're seeing a lot more diving into who the directors are. In fact,
right, that's an artifact of universal proxy. Make the comparisons.
You're
a lot
making
more direct.
individual cases now, right? And so you're seeing like more approaches against existing directors and for their directors on a case by case sort of merit basis, and it's dovetailing with so far this year and the votes that have happened that we have data for. The G-driven, governance-driven proponents, like the John Chevedens of the world, the Ken Steiners of the world, like these long-time, like simple majority voting, like just traditional anti-poison.
Right, they're looking to improve some of the basic governance terms.
Basic stuff.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Those proponents are getting nearly, on average, 50% of the vote, up from 42.5% of the vote last year, meaning investors are effectively looking for activists to find the companies where the governance might be worse than everywhere else. They are paying attention to it. They are voting more in favor alongside the activists in terms of both wins and the average vote for, and governance proponents in general are seeing more and more favorability, meaning the shift is now, I think, activists are the tip of the spear of governance, and these proponents are laying the foundation for basically change, and investors like it.
For these longer term improvements, because governance changes are definitely something that's not going to move share price this week. It's something that's going to help you. And the other observation I'll make, and then I want to talk about some specific individual, as we'll say, situations, is you're working the stats you're kind of tossing out here are based on a very large data set. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is really credible. So for you to say that support went down from 96 or 97% for the average board support down to below 95 or 94, 93 or whatever, that's based on that's significant.
It's a lot. Yeah,
right, exactly.
Especially and as you said before, as in a rational apathy environment.
Yeah,
those little changes, and I know this from speaking to directors themselves, they hate when somebody else in the boardroom got a higher vote share than they did, even if it's 1%.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of comparisons, like a lot of measurement contests.
There is some measuring. Yes. And
exactly.
it's like it affects how they view the job, like how they interact with their peers. And we know the PwC surveys of the boards every single year. The last survey found that on average, every board thinks at least one director shouldn't be there.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of criticism that they'll kind of report in a survey that they may not necessarily tell a director to their face.
It's classic team stuff, right? Like, that guy's always been
middle school.
Sucked at his job. It is. It's like middle school.
All right. Why don't we? Like I said, there's a bunch of individual contests we can talk about. Then we can talk about some of the other trends in ESG and governance. But let's do that after a quick break, and then we can return to talk about more of the corp gov developments here at Shareholder Primacy.
Shareholder Primacy is brought to you by FreeFloatAnalytics.com, the only free database of corporate directors, their influence, and their performance. If you own a stock or retirement plan, go to FreeFloatAnalytics.com and look up which of your elected directors are performing well and which aren't. Use your vote in the alternative democracy and get your data at FreeFloatAnalytics.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Mike Levin, talking here with Matt Moscardi of Free Float Media about what's going on so far in Proxy season 2025. So we've talked about some of the aggregates, but there's some really interesting stuff going on that's kind of behind all this for some individual situations that I thought we would kind of talk about a little bit. The big contest, everyone likes to focus on kind of one or two, that looks like it's kind of emerging unless they settle this thing, is our favorite Elliott Management, badass activist, running a proxy contest at Phillips 66 PSX. Now, the background on this is, PSX has just, been sort of an underperformer for a while. And so Elliott, you can't do that without Elliott sniffing it out or somebody like that. So Elliott sort of on the surface just nominated 4 directors. And PSX is interesting as a large, oil and gas company, S&P 500 company. It still has a classified board, which most larger companies have kind of departed from. Anyway, Elliott, in March on deadline, nominated 4 people, and right away, PSX started rearranging its board. They said 2 people aren't going to stand for election, so the classes were all uneven. And right away, you can't do that to Elliott. Elliott marched right into Chancery Court and sued their butts off and said, you can't do this. So there was a lawsuit. I'm pretty sure the lawsuit's on hold right now because according to the definitive proxy that Phillips 66 filed, there are now 4 seats up. So the original class was kind of preserved. But now there's a couple other interesting things going on. Phillips put on the ballot a declassification proposal to say, okay, we're going to declassify the board. Great, rah, rah, rah. The problem is that requires shareholder approval of all things. Most companies can declassify just by changing the bylaws. Well, this particular set of governance documents, bylaws and certificate of incorporation or charter, requires an 80% supermajority to change this. And evidently, Phillips has tried this 6 times to try to get this majority or this amount of shareholder turnout to change this, and it's failed every time. And I would question, I actually wrote about this in a post a little while ago, I would question how seriously Phillips is actually trying to do this.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But this year, given the attention, they may get the turnout that they need. And then Elliott had a really clever way to try to get around this. Elliott, when they submitted their nominees, back in February or March, didn't know what other proposals would be out there, and probably wasn't aware that Phillips was going to be putting up with this declassification proposal. Elliott proposed, and this is a precatory proposal, so it's not actually binding, but they recommended that there be a mandatory annual director resignation. So every time a director is appointed or reelected, they submit a kind of a standing and evergreen resignation letter. And so they were trying to get around this 80% supermajority by saying that there's this mandatory director resignation annually. No one had ever really seen that tried before as a way to kind of get around classified boards. But that's a proposal that's out there, and given Elliott's kind of power and they're willing to spend money and this kind of stuff, I would give that a pretty good shot of succeeding, as well as with the declassification. So this one, I think the message here is this one is getting really complicated. It's getting really heated. I can't see this settling in anytime soon.
I got a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
And this is sort of a philosophical question, because Elliott is pointing out basically structural impediments, and the board has to approve, expanding the board and
right.
all the tricks that they use, the board effectively has to approve at some point. Why do you not see activists or even investors in general, if you assume Elliott pulls something out here, why do you not see them target these same directors at other companies? Because there's a cultural thing, right? According to our data, the Phillips 66 board, they're a mature blue chip U.S. company. They've been around for a bajillion years. Right. The average director on this board is connected to 1.5 other directors on this board through nonprofits, other boards, business ventures.
It's definitely pretty insular that way. All right,
these are insular boards. It's like Exxon. It's like most of a lot of the Midwest companies are like this. The Abbott Labs, the Boeings, these traditional large U.S. mature companies. Why do you not look at this board and say, well, forget the classified nature of it. What about a vote no campaign on these people are on multiple boards, almost all of them. A vote no campaign somewhere else? What about tracking the people who are sort of coming? Why does that not happen that much?
Because I have a couple of thoughts about that. First, most activists along the lines that we've been talking about, the Elliots, the Starbirds, and so forth, the kind of resources they pour into an individual project are really considerable. All right. So they're not going to just target another director in another company unless there's, or target the same director. Suppose
director,
Elliott
right.
saw, three directors at Philips, and they say, okay, let's see what other boards they're going to be on. Okay. They may eventually say, okay, there's two directors here that are also on the same board at some other oil and gas company, and we're gonna use that to our advantage. You won't see that for a year or two. All right, they're not gonna try to make life hard for that director, those couple directors at their other boards, unless the value proposition at those other companies is sufficiently compelling. Okay, they and I've seen that happen a little bit where you're going to try to exert some pressure on some directors by saying, okay, we're going to do it, but they're not going to be very public about it. So it's definitely a tactic that that one or another fund will try to do, but you're not going to turn it into like a full blown proxy contest. At some other place. Again, the most that's going to happen is maybe a vote no.
Yeah, that's what I would think. I would think like on the Phillips 66 board, like Glenn Tilton's on AbbVie and Phillips 66, right? He's got 13-year tenure at both places, and you have if you're Elliott, you don't have necessarily an economic interest in AbbVie. You have it in Phillips 66. Right. But if Tilton's not up for a board seat this year, and he's part of a board that's sort of like, you could vote no, just Prec 14A at any company where these directors are on the board and say, look, these are directors that have a track record of obfuscating or of avoiding dealing with shareholders. Here's the evidence from this other board that they're on. I'm surprised it doesn't happen. I know there's some. You have to do some effort, right?
Right, exactly. And so just recommending vote no at some other company is probably not going to be very accretive to the portfolio.
No,
but in the short term.
But it is leverage, right?
Oh, absolutely right.
Elliott has a platform, and these directors don't. And I do think there's a social stigma if an activist targets you as an individual and not the entity of the company. That changes the tenor.
That could start to happen. And the idea that data is now available. I could tell you who to get in front of Elliott if you want.
Elliott, give us a call. We'll do it all day.
Exactly. All right. Let's talk about a couple others that were kind of in the data here that were just really interesting. You asked about kind of repeat contests. There is one out there at a company called Zevra Pharma, a little microcap. It's a sort of this kind of bumping along, not great pharmaceutical company. And it was the subject of a proxy contest, one of the first kind of successful proxy contests a couple years ago under Universal Proxy. And there was just an individual investor I've talked about, on podcasts and so forth before, a guy by the name of Dan Manglis, who's basically a car dealer in Green Bay, Wisconsin. But he's done really well for himself, and he's got some resources. And he ran this kind of guerrilla proxy contest at Zevra. In 2023, and he nominated two directors. He used social media. He targeted just the right institutions. The proxy advisors both recommended against him, and he won. He won like going away. He won like 75 or 80% of the votes or something like that. That's it's a testament in part to how badly the company was doing. But he hired, kind of a regional law firm and a proxy solicitor that barely anybody knew. Okay, and just totally dominated this one. Well, now fast forward 2 years, he's back. The company still isn't doing that great, so he's basically repeating it again, looking for 2 more board seats. And what was kind of interesting there, and we'll see what happens. I think the company hired a different solicitor. They're going to try to do this a little better. One of his nominees was the principal of the Proxy solicitor. I'd never seen that before.
That's brilliant.
Jim Reagan Reagan and Company. And there's, people in the proxy solicitation world know this firm and this person, but no one else that I talked to knew. So that person's actually a nominee for this board. And what was the other interesting part of this was that there was no kind. The reason Manglis can do this is because in 2023 he won the 2 seats kind of outright in an election. So there was no settlement agreement. There was no standstill. Right. There was nothing preventing him from kind of coming back. And that's that frequently happens. Is we read about all these settlements, which is good. It kind of avoids a little bit of the heartache of a proxy contest and allows the directors start paying attention to the company. But one of the problems with the settlement, at least for an activist, is there's a lot of rules.
Yeah,
you can't trade in and out of the stock. You can't communicate with anybody. You got to vote along with the company. There's a lot of stuff you got to do. Well, he had none of these restrictions on him. So he was able to come back and nominate 2 more directors. So that meeting is not for a little while. It's actually sometime this next month. And I think the company still has to announce the actual date. So we're going to know the result of that pretty quickly. That was the case. The repeat activist was the same thing with Massimo and Paladin, which we talked about a few minutes ago, where Paladin had won 2 seats last year. And because they won their seats outright, there was no standstill, nothing preventing them from coming back and getting 2 more seats. And we've talked about that before, about how now Paladin has a majority of that board.
The X factor there strikes me as if ISS and Glass Lewis flip. Right, like if he won in 2023, he did well by investors then. It was a landslide. Now it's harder to take him less seriously.
Yes,
and I wonder if they flip and support.
They may come back and support him this time. I would absolutely see that. All right, there's a couple others that we can talk about. The one I wanted to really mention was one that just got announced in the last week or so at our old favorite all-American company, Harley Davidson, and an activist that I know called H Partners, helmed by a guy by the name of Rehan Jaffer, is a really good under-the-radar kind of activist, but very effective. Has done couple of projects, very concentrated portfolio. 2 very successful activist projects in the past at Temper Sealy and also at Six Flags. They've been a long-time investor in Hog. And it was actually interesting. I don't know if you saw this weekend. I know you were a little out, but there was a whole kind of tell-all in the weekend Wall Street Journal about Harley Davidson and H Partners. And there's H Partners had a director that they had appointed to the board in 2022 as part of a settlement. There was a lot of disagreement about CEO succession, so that person very noisily resigned their seat about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And what was really interesting is H Partners, missed all the deadlines for being able to, nominate more directors and try to run a proxy contest here. So what they're doing is something that's a little unusual, but not, may become more common, was a vote no, withhold campaign. Again, we've talked about that. You can recommend and so forth. But they're actually doing a solicitation against 3 incumbents on the Hog board of directors. So they're not going to be able to appoint who they want. They're just saying, okay, we're going to tell the shareholders to vote against these 3. It's the board, the independent lead independent director and 2 others, and so the outcome there could be, and it's hard to tell this early. The outcome there could be that these 3, don't win the majority, and H Partners is going to put some resources into this. This isn't going to be just a vote no. They're going to really solicit hard, especially because again they have a real concentrated portfolio. This is a big part of their assets, and they're going to want to really do well by their limited partners. So if those 3 don't win a majority, they have a mandatory resignation policy.
It's brilliant.
So they'll have to resign. Now, what the company does with that is to be TBD. Most of the time, mandatory resignations as a result of not getting a majority vote just create zombie directors. So maybe Hogg will say, okay, you can stay on, or I don't know, or whatever. I'm speculating that H Partners will have some influence over those next 3. So again, that's not actually a proxy contest, but that's a solicitation for a withhold. That we'll have to see how that goes.
Well, the solicitation, like the process they're going through, it struck me when I read the letter, right? Like, is the language they use, because their targets are Zeitz, the CEO and chair, and then two other directors who are longer tenured. But the way they write about it is they're targeting those directors because of entrenchment and, quote, exerting undue influence
over the
board.
The CEO succession process, right. Yeah.
Which is fascinating because it's like a social recognition that there are a few people who are effectively running this, and the rest of the board is semi or totally marginalized.
Including the H Partners director.
Including their own director, which and they're getting that from the inside, and there's the sort of whistleblower aspect of this. So there is this fascinating sort of, what I like about this contest is it's almost a social contest, right? Like if you can't nominate your own directors, you can't make your traditional pitch of this company's underperforming and here's all the reasons why you should vote for these directors over the existing ones. They are taking the approach that's almost like what I was saying before, which is like, well, these three directors are effectively controlling the board, and they're exerting undue influence, and we see a situation in which the company is not pivoting the way it needs to. We don't need to replace them with our candidates. What we need to do is create a influence vacuum, change the social dynamic in the boardroom.
And that's what I think that's in part what H Partners is trying to accomplish here. So anyway, there's a bunch more of these we can talk about, but we'll deal with that at another time. There's some other things in proxy season that we should probably address here. There's some other trends and developments that, depending where you sit, may not be quite as positive as what we've been talking about, kind of for financial or hedge fund or activists. And this has to do with a definite chill in what's going on in sort of the proposal world, among ESG proponents and so forth. So some of the data, which comes from the Proxy monitor, is ESG proposals have decreased dramatically compared to last year. 34% fewer were just even submitted to companies, U.S. companies, this year compared to last year. And the no action requests, again, that's where you go to the SEC to ask permission to not have shareholders considered, have tripled. Compared to 2024. Now, it's a little early. The SEC, especially these days, is probably kind of strapped, and so they kind of act on these at the last minute. But the expectation is that far fewer proposals will be on company AGM agendas as a result of both many fewer being submitted and a lot more being excluded. So, one of the emblematic examples is ExxonMobil, XOM, will have, for the first time in at least 25 years, 0 shareholder proposals on their AGM for this year.
That's the troubling one, because if they're the canary in the coal mine, then what the message here is, if you sue the shareholders you don't like, the likelihood that they come back next year is near zero, right? And there was no repercussions for the ExxonMobil board, and despite many pension funds, saying they were going to vote against,
complaining loudly, members. Oh man, you can't do this. You're
you can't do this. You're suing your own shareholders. They still all won re-election, right? So there was no real repercussion. But some of the drop in ESG proposals is a little misleading. In as much as the inside scoop is we're actually seeing less proposals and more negotiated sort of settlements outside of a proposal. So what companies are doing increasingly is they're working with these proponents that they know, the as you sows of the world, the religious investors, the ones that they've been dealing with the Trillium, 20, 30 years of shareholder proposals. They know who these people are. They know, they know what the conversation is going to be like, rather than getting in a public battle in which you're going to draw the ire of the SEC, of Trump administration. They're now having closed door sort of shareholder meetings. Oh,
interesting. So they'll go to one of these proponents and say, look, I know you submitted this. Right now it's not public. if we do XYZ, can we make this go
Exactly.
away? And those are serious discussions. In the past, that had always been just kind of a charade.
Exactly. And now there's more negotiation happening outside of the public eye. So it's like a chill. It's an optic chill, but
Right.
it may not actually be
interesting.
like a total loss of the ESG proposal. And frankly, it forces a lot of the sort of superfluous ESG proposals to get more
sure.
serious in the first
Right.
place, right? Like,
Right. So
'cause if
they're
you're
gonna structure these a lot more carefully. They're not gonna run them
Everything's
through a
more careful.
copier and send them to 20 companies.
Exactly. That method, actually, the data on that method is the anti-ESG proposals, which have jumped from 23% of proposals
Right.
in 2024 to 40% of the ESG proposals,
Oh, wow. Is that
according to the
high?
Conference Board. Almost 1 in 2 ESG proposals are
These
actually
so-called anti-ESG and those are
ESG
only coming from like
proposals.
2 or 3 proponents.
And they're only coming from like a couple of proponents,
Like
and
the
they're
national
all
policy, legal, whatever. That's
and they are actually literally copy pasting their own proposals amongst each other.
Yeah.
And the average support for those is hovering around 2%. It's
Right.
not getting better. It's not getting worse. No one cares about them.
Right.
So you may have a situation where optically the sort of conservative movement, the anti-ESG, anti-woke, whatever movement
Right.
looks like it's succeeding. The SEC is allowing more of it, but actually the ESG movement has gotten smarter, more targeted,
Right.
Doing actual negotiations in non-public, like you can't see it.
Right.
So it's hard to. It's going to be this year's going to be weird because it's going to be
We're
hard
trying
to
to
tell
sort
like
of see
who's
what the
winning.
trends look like when we're all done.
Right,
It'll be-
like you basically have to wait until next year's reporting season to see did anybody win last year because it's hard to tell.
So I think I have a couple observations just based on what you said, which is first that these anti-ESG proponents, which are interesting, they're interesting. I don't love them, but those are more like lobbying firms rather than investors.
There's no data. There's no
exactly.
data. Yeah.
They're not like got a bunch of assets behind them, and this is what we want. So they're learning kind of the hard way what ESG proponents have experienced for many years.
Exactly.
Is okay. We're going to submit this proposal. We love it. Seems like a great idea. Okay, we're getting 2% 2 years in a row. This isn't good. I think the second observation is that, and I've seen this a little bit, is that there's some cheering. Okay, these anti-ESG proposals are getting such little support. And I think part of the problem is that that's not necessarily that the big indexers don't like the anti-ESG proposals. I mean, they don't. But I think it's more emblematic that there's a lot of these big indexers that just don't like shareholder proposals that much. Or they only really like very well thought out ones. And they're not even seeing them this year because they're all getting settled.
I mean, the kabuki theater of it is the difference between a 2% vote for and a 12% vote for is nothing. Like they still lost. Everybody lost, right? Like so. Like there's a lot of conversation about they're getting bad vote results. Frankly, the data suggests there are proponent-driven votes more than there are proposal-driven votes.
That's
meaning
a good point.
The John Cheveddens of the world who have been doing this for 30 years
and very credible.
Well.
They're an irritant to some people, but they're very credible. They pick their shots
target.
well.
Exactly. They pick their shots and they do it well. They get more votes. And John Chevedden puts in any proposal now because he's been around so long and he's credible. He gets higher votes than most other proponents, right? Like, so there's a proponent drive here more than there is like in credibility here, more than there is like a proposal drive. And frankly, none of the anti-ESG proposal proponents are even remotely credible. Like the Boyer researches of the world do research without data. Like they're what the funny thing is for our show Business Pants, we make jokes about this all the time. You see a proposal that says like so-and-so represented by Boyer Research, or, so they find a shareholder and then Boyer Research does the proposal. The so-and-sos, one of them was a person who doesn't exist anywhere. We looked everywhere. like honestly, we looked at like housing records, Social Security, wherever we could find data. Like we went deep with LexisNexis, like anything you could find about a human being. We couldn't find the person, right? Like so, it's like even the people that are supposed to have the shares, and now they have to say like how many shares that they have roughly, and it's like representing one share of a person who may or may not exist.
May not be.
You lose all credibility. So I actually think the sort of death of the ESG proposal is way overstated. I think there's a reality that's somewhere in the middle. I think it's much more targeted, and there's much more backdoor negotiation happening than we know about, right?
Yeah.
And on the flip side, you're right. The anti-ESG people, the anti-woke, whatever, they're actually going to learn. They got 10 years to learn the hard lesson of copy paste doesn't work, guys. It doesn't work.
You got to really think a lot harder about that.
Yeah.
All right. We have a moment before we should let our listeners kind of move on to something else. Any other quick comments about what we've seen so far? We'll do this again. We'll probably do a wrap up, you and me, sometime in the next couple months. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think the last takeaway on this point is really ExxonMobil is like the 14G filing changes and the ExxonMobil not getting a shareholder thing are the concerning things.
Yes,
right? Like those to me. Not necessarily a drop in shareholder proposals from ESG or anti-ESG or whatever.
Right.
The concerning ones, the chill on governance is like basically limiting indexers any voice through 13G filing changes, which we talked about in a show before.
Right, and also the expansion of the of how the SEC can exclude these.
Exactly. Like the part and parcel with that basically the regulatory shift, chilling the shareholder voice, and then the shareholders self-chilling after ExxonMobil sued. Because I don't know what they're thinking, but when a bully takes your lunch money, they don't stop taking your lunch money.
They keep going.
Lunch, and they were like, "Oh, now I'm full. I had lunch." They come back the next day for it. So like suing your shareholder, it just becomes
it's a permission structure, as we've learned.
Exactly, it's a permission slip. So that is more chilling, more dangerously chilling in my mind. So those are the things to watch. I think.
Cool. All right, let's move on here. I think we can call it a day.
You think 47 minutes of governance talk was enough? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It's terrific talking to you about all this. This is Shareholder Primacy, usually hosted by Ann Lipton and me, Mike Levin. I'm an independent activist investor and advisor to investors about their activist situations. Today, we've been talking to Matt Moscardi of Free Float Analytics. You can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com, and you can find Matt at freefloat.llc. Our podcast is produced and distributed by guess who? Matt at Free Float Media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.